Just because of her dark skin and silent demeanor as she walked past a restricted zone, the black woman was immediately met with a gun pointed at her face by Officer Brent Holloway. But just seconds later, the security scan lit up in bright red, Delta, in clearance. The person he intended to humiliate was a retired Army general who had once commanded classified operations. What punishment awaits the man who thought he had the right to treat others with contempt through 5 months? Stay until the end to find the answer. The scanner let out a sharp beep that didn't match any protocol sound Brent Holloway had heard before. A cold blue light bathed the narrow security corridor outside the south wall of the precinct. Standard optical wash, meant to pick up biometric traces. It should have been routine. It should have pinged a name, a record, a tax status, a last known address, a birth certificate, a next of kin, even a damn dog license. Instead, it spat out nothing. No match. No identity, no trace, just a pulsing red message that blinked 3 times on the officer's wrist HUD. Restricted clearance required. Holloway stared at the readout, then back at the woman standing calmly in front of him, her hands visible, unshaking. She hadn't twitched, hadn't blinked. The woman was black, late 50s maybe, short-cropped silver hair, skin like dark mahogany, polished, smooth with time and silence. She wore a muted gray coat that fell just past her knees. No jewelry, no visible electronics, nothing that screamed danger, nothing that screamed anything, and yet the air around her felt electrified, like the static before a thunderstorm you never saw coming. Holloway stepped forward, just enough to fill her peripheral vision. He didn't like being ignored. "Ma'am," he said, careful but firm, "this is a restricted perimeter. I need to see your ID." She looked at him, not in surprise, not in defiance, just looked, direct, clean, unapologetic, then turned her eyes to the camera embedded in the scanner tower and held them there, as if sending a message Holloway couldn't intercept. The silence made the young patrolman standing behind Holloway shift his weight. He was 22, fresh out of the academy, and suddenly very aware of how cold his fingers felt inside his gloves. "I said ID," Holloway repeated, voice sharper this time. The woman raised her left hand, not high, not hurried, just enough to let the scanner catch her fingertips. Another scan, another mechanical failure. The screen flickered, sputtered, then declared again, no match, no biometric presence found. A secondary light above them buzzed faintly, then turned amber. Holloway's jaw tightened. This was not standard. This wasn't even irregular. This was ghost-level clearance territory. He motioned to the patrolman. "Run a manual check. Cross-match, IRS, DNV, voter roll, passport registry, everything. I want a thread." The kid swallowed hard, nodded, and tapped frantically on his portable console. Nothing. No record of her face, her fingerprints, her gait pattern, or her vocal signature. It was like trying to trace the identity of wind. Holloway turned back toward her, a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Not friendly, not curious, something cold. "A nameless ghost out for a walk in the civilian zone?" he said, voice dipped in mockery. Her eyes cut toward him again. Still no fear, no agitation, just that unbearable stillness. Then she spoke, quiet, measured, as if correcting a student's logic, not answering a question. "Wrong question, officer." Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" She said nothing more. No smirk, no challenge. Just the return to that deliberate, unnatural stillness. The kind of calm that only comes from knowing you're the only one in the room who understands what's going on. He stepped closer. Not aggressively, not yet, but enough to measure her height, the distance from his holster, the angle of the nearest security camera. His instincts itched. He activated his chest scanner. One more time. The machine whirred, clicked, and hesitated. Then the interface glitched and froze entirely. It rebooted, came back online, and flashed a solid red across the screen. Access denied. Oversight required. He turned his head slightly, voice low into the comm. "Dispatch, I've got a subject with 0 civilian footprint. No ID, no traceable history. Systems rejecting the scan. Code red clearance block." A crackle of static. No response. Behind him, the younger officer whispered, "Sir, the camera, It just zoomed in by itself. Holloway's eyes snapped to the tower cam. He hadn't touched the override. The lens was zoomed in tight on the woman's face. Her expression hadn't changed, but something shifted in the air, something Holloway couldn't name. The sensation crawled up the back of his neck and settled like ice on the base of his skull. He took a step back. "Let me make this simple," Holloway said, his voice sharpening. "You're either someone playing a very dangerous game or someone who shouldn't be walking the streets. Which is it?" She didn't answer, didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed on the camera, her hands still calmly at her sides. Her breath, barely perceptible, was slow, deliberate, like someone waiting or watching. Holloway narrowed his eyes. He'd seen criminals bluff, liars sweat, suspects fold under pressure. But this wasn't bluffing. This was control, unmovable, and it irritated the hell out of him. "Fine," he said, motioning for the patrolman. "Detain her. We'll ask the right questions inside." Still no reaction from the woman. As the young officer hesitated to move, clearly unsure whether to touch her, Holloway stepped forward again and took point. He reached out, not roughly, but with enough authority to make contact. Her eyes finally shifted from the camera to meet his. He froze. There was no challenge in that look, no anger, but also no submission. Just an unwavering, unbroken stare that pierced straight through decorum and protocol, straight into the fragile scaffolding of assumed control. For a moment, Holloway wasn't sure who was detaining whom. He broke eye contact first. "Inside," he said, more to himself than to her. "Now." She moved at her own pace, not resisting, not hurrying. The corridor lights dimmed momentarily as she stepped past the scanner gate, and as she did, the system let out one final note, a sound Holloway had never heard before. Not an error, not a warning, a child, soft, singular, as if something, not someone, had been acknowledged. Holloway didn't speak. He just followed, jaw clenched, hand near his weapon. The patrolman lingered behind, casting a last nervous glance at the camera tower, which had now turned itself off completely. Behind them, the corridor lights resumed their normal brightness, but the chill didn't leave. It stayed suspended in the air, like an unfinished sentence. And the woman, who had no file, no name, no fear, walked forward into the precinct like it belonged to her all along. The woman's words hung in the air like static after a storm. "Wrong question, officer." A blade so finely honed it sliced without sound. Holloway didn't reply. He didn't need to. He simply turned, gesturing with a flick of his wrist toward the reinforced door ahead, as if he had orchestrated the entire thing, and she was merely the next scene in his procedural play. She followed, without resistance, silent and composed, every step echoing with eerie precision on the polished floor, not hurried, not hesitant, as though the building had memorized her cadence long before her feet ever touched its surface. The hallway narrowed. Lights dimmed slightly, whether by design or defect was unclear, but it lent the passage a kind of womb-like tension, claustrophobic, pressurized, and brimming with expectation. They entered interrogation room 3. The walls were lined with acoustic panels, charcoal gray and silent as tombstones. A single steel table stood in the center, flanked by 2 chairs, one standard issue, the other reinforced, bolted to the floor. She took the unbolted one, of course. Holloway entered last, sealing the door with a heavy click. He didn't speak at first. Instead, with deliberate calm, he removed the holster from his side and slid the Glock out. The motion wasn't rushed or theatrical. It was slow, deliberate, meant to carry the weight of implied violence without requiring permission. He placed the weapon flat on the table, barrel angled just slightly toward her. Not a threat, technically, not yet. But the message couldn't have been louder if he'd shouted it through a bullhorn. She didn't glance at the gun. Not once. Instead, her eyes lifted toward the analog clock mounted above the two-way mirror. Her gaze locked on to the ticking second hand, as though it were a metronome she alone could hear, syncing her breath, her pulse, her silence to some invisible rhythm that Holloway couldn't break. He dropped a thin manila folder onto the table. It slapped flat with a thud too loud for its weight but perfectly timed for effect. The folder was empty. He made sure she noticed. "This," he said, leaning forward, voice smooth as oil over cold metal, is your file. Blank, not redacted, not sealed, not even fake, just nothing. He opened the folder as if revealing a secret, then slammed it shut with his palm. You don't exist. Not to the IRS, not to the census, not to immigration, not to our biometric grid, not to the goddamn dog license bureau. You are a void, lady, a black hole wrapped in a coat. Still no response. Her attention remained on the clock. Holloway followed her gaze, then back to her face, now angled slightly upward, expression unreadable. He hated that. He thrived on tells, sweat, blinking, twitching lips, shifting eyes. She gave him none of it. She was a mirror that refused to reflect him. His voice lowered to a growl. So, here's what happens now. You tell me who you are, where you live, and what your reason was for entering a restricted perimeter outside a federal precinct, or I drag you through every level of violation protocol until you beg for a public defender and a name to hide behind. Still nothing. Her eyes shifted only once to the reflection of the clock and the metallic edge of the table, then returned to him, steady, unafraid, sharp as a diamond. The room felt tighter now, though neither had moved. Holloway leaned closer, forearms planted, shadow crossing over her face. You think this is a test of wills? He spat. You think silence buys you anything but time? Time's not your friend in here. He tapped the folder again. You don't have a file, but I'll build one from scratch. Brick by damn brick. I'll dig through every surveillance channel on the eastern seaboard, cross-match every untagged faceprint, and when I find that tells me who you are, I'm going to make sure your name doesn't just end up on a list. She turned her head toward him just slightly, lips parting at last, her voice low, crystalline, like water dripping in a cave with no bottom. You're still asking the wrong questions. He slammed a fist against the table, making the Glock jump. No, I'm asking the only questions that matter. He reached into his coat and retrieved the encoded ID card he had lifted during the pat-down. Its surface shimmered with a texture not standard to any government or military issue, coated in some kind of material that refracted light like fish scales under pressure. He held it up to the scanner embedded in the corner of the interrogation desk. The machine chirped once, then buzzed loudly and sharply, the kind of error tone that didn't belong in any readable manual. Heat surged from the port. Holloway cursed and yanked his hand back. What the? The scanner's panel glowed red-hot for a brief second, then shut down completely. Smoke rose faintly from the vent slot. Still, she said nothing. He looked at her, breath tight, eyes flaring. What is this? Who issued this to you? Delta-level clearance? That's black site territory. That's ghost protocol. He picked up the card again with 2 fingers like it was radioactive, studying the symbols on the back, none of them readable, all of them deliberately unfamiliar. You're not deep cover. You're deeper than that. She tilted her head, almost sympathetically, as though watching a child slowly come to terms with a hard truth. He leaned in again. You're not going to walk out of here until I know who signed off on your existence. Finally, she responded, quiet, measured, inescapable. I'm not answering you, she said, each syllable as clean and cold as a scalpel. Not because I'm afraid, but because you're speaking the wrong language. He blinked. What? She didn't elaborate, just turned her attention back to the clock. Holloway looked over his shoulder, suddenly aware of how loud the ticking sounded. Every tick felt like a countdown he hadn't been told about. He hated that feeling. Hated not knowing what game was being played. Worse, that he might not be the one who started it. He straightened up, reholstering the Glock without ceremony. She watched him, not his hands, not the weapon, but his eyes. He could feel it, like she was measuring more than his reactions. She was measuring his core. She wasn't here for answers. She was here to record responses. That realization slid under his skin like ice. Holloway walked to the corner, activated the secondary comm panel. Subject is non-responsive, refusing identification, possible psychological warfare tactic, recommend escalation. The line went dead. He tapped again. Nothing. Not static, not noise, absence. He turned around sharply. The air felt thicker, oppressive, and she, still seated, still silent, was the one anchoring the room. "Who are you?" he demanded again, but this time it came out thinner than he meant. Less steel, more echo. She didn't reply, because that was the answer. She was the question. He just hadn't realized he was the one being asked. The silence had texture now, thick, tactile. Holloway could almost feel it clinging to the walls, pressing against the edges of the one-way glass, curling like smoke into the air vents. She hadn't moved an inch since her last words, but something about the room had shifted. It wasn't the temperature, it was the weight, like oxygen had thinned around her and multiplied around him, like the dynamic had rearranged itself without permission. He stood across the table, the Glock still resting between them, and for the first time in the last hour, his authority didn't feel like armor. It felt like a bluff. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't dart, didn't flinch, just stayed fixed on him, unwavering, unreadable, unbothered. Holloway's fingers twitched. It was involuntary. He closed them into a fist, slowly, deliberately. A reminder to himself that control was not just posture, it was perception, and he wouldn't lose it. Not to her, not in this room. "You think this is a stare down?" he asked. His voice low, lacquered with disdain. "You think you can outlast me with a pair of quiet eyes? And no goddamn answers?" She didn't respond. Her hands remained still on her lap, and her breathing was so even it might as well have been artificial. Holloway narrowed his gaze. He leaned forward, both palms pressed to the metal table, voice sharpening to a razor's edge. "You walk into my sector like you belong to no one. No registry, no laws. You sit there with that calm, like you're above this, like I don't matter." He sneered, bitter and cold. "I matter. I decide what happens in this room." He reached for the Glock. In one clean motion, he lifted the weapon and pointed it directly at her chest. Not a bluff, not for show. He meant it to hit, to puncture, to disrupt the untouchable stillness that had cocooned her since the moment she walked through the scanner gate. But she didn't twitch. Her expression didn't shift. There wasn't even the smallest flicker of fear. Instead, she turned her head slightly, just enough for her gaze to land directly into the barrel, and then into his eyes. That's when it hit him, not with a bang, but with a chill. She wasn't under threat. He was under observation. "Shoot," she said softly. The word so devoid of urgency it sounded more like a suggestion than a dare. Holloway's grip tightened. His finger rested along the trigger guard, not yet inside it, but his knuckles had gone pale. The Glock felt heavier than it should have, like it knew it didn't belong in this exchange. "You're not invincible," he spat. Her voice came again, smooth and precise, no louder than before, but this time it carved into the air like a scalpel. "Guns aren't proof of power. Your reaction is," he faltered. Not visibly, not entirely, but enough. His right hand, the one gripping the weapon, trembled. A microsecond stutter in the nerves, almost imperceptible. Almost. She saw it. He knew she saw it. His brain screamed for correction, control, but instead of calming, his body betrayed him further. He switched the gun into his left hand. Automatic, desperate, unconscious. He didn't realize he'd done it. Her eyes did not follow the gun. They stayed on his right hand, still twitching slightly, the fingers not quite steady. The overhead light flickered. Just once. A brief pulse. Like a camera flash through a lens you weren't supposed to notice. Holloway looked up instinctively, eyes narrowing. "System glitch," he muttered under his breath, though the thought didn't sit right. That wasn't a power surge. That was an override. Remote. She used the moment, just enough, to speak again. "Did you ever serve?" she asked. Not an accusation, not a challenge. A question. Plain and clinical. "What?" he barked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. She kept her voice measured. "Or did you learn how to intimidate from academy manuals and locker room echoes?" He took a step back. The Glock now lowered slightly. Not enough to admit defeat, but enough to acknowledge the room was no longer just his to command. "You're not running this," he said, trying to regather control, but it landed too thin, too hollow. "You think sitting in silence makes you special, makes you beyond consequence? Her eyes narrowed just a breath, not enough to qualify as emotion, but enough to convey focus. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even particularly interested in defending herself. She was watching, evaluating, not the kind of assessment that led to legal action, but the kind that classified people by type, by threat level, by potential, by failure. Holloway stepped around the table now, circling her like a wolf sniffing for a crack in the armor. "You think you got something on me? You think this ends with you walking out and me breaking down, like I've done something wrong?" She didn't follow him with her gaze. That unnerved him more than if she had. He stopped. "You've been scanned, tested, logged, and nothing's come back, so either you're synthetic, illegal, by the way, or you've been buried by someone who can erase records from every federal database in the system. And I don't think that kind of erasure comes cheap." Still no reaction. He slammed the side of his fist on the table. Not the gun hand this time, but enough to send a vibration through the steel. The gun rattled once. Her posture didn't change. She looked at the clock again, almost bored, as if tracking not what had happened, but what was meant to happen next. His voice dropped into a near whisper. "What's going to happen at the top of the hour?" Her eyes flicked back to his. That flicker, calculated, surgical, was the closest thing to a reply he'd gotten all day. Something was coming, and he wasn't ready for it. "Let me make this clear," he said, standing still again, hand tightening on the Glock, though now it was more for comfort than for leverage. "You're not going to get to the end of this interview with that smug silence. I will find your name. I will build your damn profile from the dust if I have to. Even if you've never existed before now, I'll carve you into the system." She looked at him with a gaze so steady it made his words sound like white noise. Then she said, low and crisp, "That's the problem with your kind. You think power is something you threaten with, but real power never has to raise its voice." That cut deeper than any insult. The lights flickered again. Twice this time, and somewhere behind the walls, a relay clicked. A lock disengaged, or engaged. Holloway wasn't sure anymore. He stared at her, his face unreadable, trying to calibrate again. But it was too late. He was no longer the interrogator. He was the subject under scrutiny, and she was in the room. It happened quietly, almost accidentally, as Holloway circled the table one more time. His patience thinned to the last layer of civility. His eyes, sharp with suspicion and simmering frustration, drifted across her lap, her sleeves, her coat, searching for an anchor, something tangible to reclaim control. Then he saw it, tucked inside the inner lining of her jacket. Not hidden, not secured, simply there. A sliver of silver, smooth and seamless, catching the overhead light with an odd refraction, as if it absorbed the glow instead of reflecting it. His fingers moved before his mind caught up. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a card, metallic, cold, heavier than it looked, with a density that suggested it wasn't made to be handed out, only handed down. Holloway turned it over in his palm, inspecting the surface. No name. No photo, no government seal, just a sleek brushed silver rectangle with a micro-layered texture that shimmered in an impossible pattern, like it was coded not for vision but for systems. And on the back, engraved deep enough to cast a shadow, were the words Delta O Clearance. Unauthorized access will result in federal criminal liability. He exhaled slowly, his breath catching just enough to betray something he wouldn't name. Delta 1 was a myth in precinct lore, a classification tier whispered about in security briefings and dismissed by officers who'd never come within 3 clearance levels of it. It wasn't meant to be real. It was the kind of clearance level that outranked even the people authorized to say it existed, and now it was sitting in his hand. Holloway raised his eyes to her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something else behind his gaze. Not respect, not awe, but the edges of an uncomfortable recognition. She watched him silently, as if she'd known he would find it, as if this part had already been rehearsed, not by her, but by him, unknowingly. "This isn't yours," he said, trying to regain control through skepticism. No civilian carries this. You're bluffing. Her lips didn't move. Her stillness was louder than any denial. It was the kind of silence that didn't invite argument. It dared it. I'm going to scan it, he said, like a man announcing a move in a chess game he suspected was already lost. She tilted her head slightly. No objection, not warning, just acknowledgement. He stepped to the wall panel, activated the console, and pressed the card to the scanner. The system hesitated, then whirred, then stopped. All screens across the room went black for 3 full seconds. In that breathless pause, even the air conditioning seemed to halt. Then a new screen blinked on. Not blue, not white, but a burning, urgent red. Federal Mathvo detected. Alert level, crimson. The terminal let out a low, pulsing tone. Not an error, not a failure. A siren reimagined for silence. Holloway instinctively pulled the card back. The scanner's faceplate glowed red-hot. He felt the heat ripple against his skin. The room's ambient lights dimmed slightly. The faintest flicker at the edges of vision, like the system had just inhaled, unsure of what to do next. He looked down at the card in his hand, then scanned it again. Same response. Red, alarm, silence. On the third scan, the screen didn't just react, it collapsed. Every display on the wall died instantly, then rebooted into a black screen with one command prompt, blinking slowly. Remote, observer, connected. Then came the chime, soft, sing, like a doorbell pressed from another universe. Holloway's mouth went dry. He turned to her. She hadn't moved. Her eyes tracked his every motion, not like a subject under interrogation, but like someone grading his performance, watching his grip tighten on the card like it might offer answers if he held it long enough. "You need to explain this," he said. His voice tried to be steel, but the blade was dull now. "Where did you get this?" Her gaze dropped to the card for the first time, and her voice followed. Low and quiet, but as sharp as a wire drawn through fire. "That card isn't for you." He scowled. "I'm holding it, and it's already recording," she replied, calm as gravity. "I'd suggest you put it down before it starts collecting thoughts, not just actions." His jaw clenched. "You're lying." Her silence returned, not defensive, just patient, like she'd seen this denial before, like she always did. He stared back at the screen. The blinking prompt changed. Subject engaged. Observation. Active. "Who the hell is watching this?" he demanded, spinning toward the overhead camera. "Who just linked into my system?" The screen blinked again. Access to grant. Continue. He looked down at the card in his hand, suddenly aware of its temperature. Warmer now, subtly, like it had adjusted to his skin, like it was alive. "Who were you?" he asked again, but the question fell flat this time, barely echoing in the charged air between them. The room felt crowded now, not with people, but with presence, the sense that someone, or something, was watching through a lens too sophisticated for glass, listening through a channel that didn't need microphones, evaluating not just behavior, but intent, patterns, micro-reactions. This system had joined the conversation. He paced back toward the table, the card still in his grip, a sliver of heat burning into his palm. "Your test," he said suddenly, as if the thought had spilled from some dark corner of understanding. "This whole thing is a setup. You walked into my zone, triggered a security cascade, dropped a federal override, and now what? I'm being watched to see how far I go?" She gave no confirmation, but her eyes, those damn eyes, held his just long enough for the implication to land. "You want to see what I'll do with this?" he said, lifting the card slightly. "You want to see if I'll push it, abuse it, break the rules to crack you open?" Still no reply. "But I won't give you that," he snapped. "I know the game now. You're bait, and I'm the subject." A pause. Then she said, as calm as a judge sealing a verdict, "No, you were the subject before I entered the room. You're only just realizing it." The light above flickered again. The screen pulsed, and the card, still warm in his hand, began to hum. The card in Holloway's hand was still humming when the room shifted, not by sound, not by movement, but by a change so visceral it felt like the floor had subtly rebalanced beneath them. The lights, once sterile, white, and clinical, blinked once, then bathed the entire space in a deep, arterial red. It wasn't a warning hue, it was surgical, a signal that something had moved beyond procedure and into protocol. Above the door, a digital panel snapped to life, lines of code racing across its narrow frame before settling into one phrase pulsing in bold crimson letters. Sentry, lockdown. There was no audible click, no dramatic slam. The change was silent, absolute. The door didn't budge when Holloway turned to it. No beep, no mechanical hum, just dead metal. He turned back toward the center of the room, his breath catching as every terminal screen winked out, then returned with a new interface. Not precinct blue, not neutral gray, but black, matte and depthless. Like the system had switched from collecting data to analyzing it in real time. On every screen, a single designation rotated in precise intervals. Live feed, federal oversight, channel engaged. The room was no longer just surveilled. It was being watched. His instinct kicked in. Holloway lunged for the door, slammed the emergency override panel with his palm, and barked into the embedded mic. "Dispatch, this is Interrogation 3. We've got a system malfunction. Force the lock and open the door. Now." A beat of silence. Then the reply came, flat and inhuman. A voice stripped of emotion and layered in code. Access denied by oversight protocol. He stared at the speaker like it had grown a face. The voice wasn't from his chain of command. It wasn't even from law enforcement infrastructure. It was foreign, higher, unreachable. Someone or something had overridden his authority at the root. He turned slowly, his jaw clenched, and faced her. She was still seated, still calm, but her right hand, previously resting in her lap, now adjusted the cuff of her left sleeve. It was a minor motion, delicate, but it revealed for just a second the underside of a custom-stitched lining and a small embedded circuit, no larger than a coin, shaped to the curve of her wrist. Not a tracker, but an ID, a trigger. She didn't gloat. She didn't even look at him as he approached. She simply finished straightening the cuff, smoothing it down with the care of someone folding a flag after a funeral. That's when she lifted her head, slowly, with precision, and met his eyes again, and smiled, barely. "Do you feel it yet?" she asked, her voice composed and toneless, like a neurologist testing the range of damage after impact. Holloway didn't answer. His heartbeat, once a steady baseline under his anger, now stuttered into uneven chords. Something primal itched at the base of his neck. He touched it, cold. Not the room, him. The way his skin responded, the chill that coiled around the base of his spine and climbed like breath from a freezer. She nodded once, barely perceptible. "That's your body catching up to the moment. Happens to most." He stepped forward, pointing at the door, the cameras, the screens. "You locked us in." "No," she replied. "The system did." "You are the system," he snapped. She shrugged lightly. "In this instance? No, but it answers to something I carry." He glanced at the card again, now resting on the interrogation table. It had stopped glowing. No heat, no hum. It lay inert, but not defeated, like a weapon that had already done its work. "What is this?" he growled. "Some kind of test? You think this scares me?" She leaned forward slightly, her voice like silk wrapped around steel. "Fear isn't the objective. Reaction is." He wanted to punch the wall. He wanted to scream into the camera, but that would give her exactly what she wanted. He was being funneled, manipulated, observed like an insect under glass. Holloway tightened his jaw, walking over to the Glock he had placed earlier. He didn't pick it up, not yet, but he stood next to it, as if proximity alone could return some sense of leverage. He didn't blink. "Instead," she said in a voice as even as a metronome, "the thing you're feeling at the back of your neck, that isn't fear. That's the absence of command. The lights flickered again. The room made a sound, barely audible, a shift in the air system, as though the vents had closed or redirected. Something overhead spun once, then stopped. Holloway looked up. The camera above the mirror rotated smoothly, then tilted down at a perfect 45-degree angle. It focused not on her, not on him, but on the card. Then it zoomed in, then stopped. He reached for his radio. "I want this lockdown lifted. Immediately. This is an unlawful detainment." The same automated voice returned, implacable and unhurried. "Your authority has been suspended for the duration of this observation." Holloway slammed the radio down on the table, and then she spoke again. "You were never the lock." He turned to her, eyes blazing. "Excuse me?" "You were the key," she said calmly, to see if the door opened inward. He froze. In the glass reflection he caught his image, sweating, jaw tight, shoulders coiled. She wasn't unraveling. He was. "You walked me into this room," she continued, "sat me down, drew the weapon, raised your voice, scanned a card that wasn't yours, violated a clearance you don't even understand. And now, when the system responds, you're surprised it didn't pick your side." He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Then, almost gently, she tilted her head and asked, "Do you feel the cold at the back of your neck now?" It was no longer a question. It was confirmation, and Holloway, who had walked in wearing a badge and a weapon, flanked by laws and protocols, was now just another man in a locked room, with a woman who never needed the key. The silence after her last words had not yet fully faded when the lock hissed again, not as a reset, but as a passage. The door that moments ago denied every override slid open with mechanical grace, not fast, not slow, but with the cold deliberation of a decision already made. Holloway spun toward it, jaw tensed, shoulders squared, expecting chaos or backup or maybe even containment. What walked in was worse. 3 men entered, moving like ghosts in civilian clothing, no badges, no weapons drawn, just the chilling ease of people who knew they belonged. They didn't ask for clearance, no one stopped them, no one questioned their access. They crossed thresholds like the laws inside this precinct had been paused to accommodate something greater. Fort Meade didn't send people like this unless the silence around their arrival was louder than any. They didn't look at her, they looked at Holloway. The first man, lean, with a file tucked tight under his arm, stepped forward and extended a crisp envelope toward Holloway without ceremony, without eye contact. The seal on the folder was unmistakable, Department of Defense. Above it, a second stamp in red ink, Field Ethics Assessment, initiated without prior notice. Holloway hesitated. His hand hovered over the file like it might burn him. Then he took it. The paper inside was thick, official, and weighted with consequence. Holloway scanned the top line. His name, his identification number. Beneath that, a signature that made the air feel heavier. Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff. He blinked, once, twice. Then a stiff laugh broke from his throat, jagged and wrong. "What the hell is this?" he asked, voice breaking slightly under the false calm. "This is some kind of audit?" The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. The presence of the document was answer enough. Holloway turned to the woman. She still hadn't moved, still seated, still silent, but the room had shifted around her, tilted the entire axis of power, like she'd known exactly what time the stars would align. He searched her face for anything, mockery, vindication, satisfaction, but found nothing. That absence unnerved him more than rage would have. "You knew," he said. Not a question. Not even an accusation, just a fragile acknowledgement spoken too late. She finally spoke. Her tone did not change. "I didn't come here to answer questions." He stepped closer, papers still in his hand like a live wire. "Then what is this?" Her eyes, sharp and ancient, didn't blink. "I came to observe." Reflex. The word landed like a blade, and Holloway suddenly felt the weight of every movement he'd made since she appeared. Every question was barked, every ounce of force applied, every escalation, every silent assumption. They weren't tactics anymore, they were symptoms, tracked, analyzed, measured. A second man standing behind the one who delivered the file spoke for the first time. His voice was clipped, professional. nearly robotic in its economy. "Your reflex has been recorded and transmitted." Holloway turned to him, face drained of heat. "Transmitted to whom?" The man didn't answer, because the answer didn't matter anymore. The test was over. She rose then, smoothly, no rush, no theater. The way a judge stands when the verdict has already been read. Her eyes passed over Holloway like a scanner, and he could feel it. Not just her gaze, but the calibration. He was being stored, catalogued, and concluded. His lips curled in a desperate grin, dry and sharp. "You can't just walk in here, trigger an audit, and flip my entire career inside out like it's a damn lab experiment." She tilted her head, softly. "Yet here we are." He looked back at the men from Fort Meade. They didn't flinch, didn't speak. They were just waiting for him to accept, for her to finish. The lights above hummed once, the cameras refocused, and Holloway, badge still clipped to his belt, gun still holstered, authority still draped across his shoulders like an old coat, finally understood. He wasn't the enforcer anymore. He was the subject, and the system had already passed judgment. The silence in the interrogation room fractured as one of the sidewall panels slid open with a soft mechanical breath, revealing a recessed projection unit embedded like a secret long buried and now summoned into function. A thin, horizontal beam of light cut across the air, and then the far wall bloomed to life. It wasn't a file. It wasn't a profile. It was a revelation. A full-screen image snapped into place. High resolution, framed in a wash of alternating blue and red light that pulsed with an authority beyond badges, beyond jurisdiction. The image, a woman in full dress uniform, medals lining her chest like stars affixed to a constellation written in blood, endurance, and command. Tucked beneath her left arm, the ceremonial cap of a general, her right hand extended in mid-shake with the Secretary of Defense, who smiled tightly beside her. The caption beneath the photo didn't need embellishment. It read, "Rosemarie Langston, General, retired, Black, Alpha, still active in classified operations." Holloway's throat closed, not from surprise, from the weight. It was crushing. That name, Langston, he had heard it before, whispered in training rooms, wrapped in cautionary footnotes of operations no one was cleared to explain. A name woven through the folds of tactical myth and strategic reality. A woman who had disappeared from public record but never from internal reverence. The moment her face hit the wall, the truth wasn't just visible, it became unavoidable. He staggered back, his knees brushing the edge of the interrogation table, but the screen didn't pause. The projection rolled into motion, slides of her deployments, overseas conflict zones, negotiations with foreign military commanders, classified briefings in sealed federal chambers. One showed her mid-speech in a room filled with high-ranking officers whose names he couldn't pronounce, but had seen stitched into Pentagon briefings. Another showed her sitting with a panel of national security directors, her voice paused in time, lips mid-syllable, like authority made flesh. The final image was silent detonation, a still frame taken from some distant federal ceremony where she stood alone on the steps of the Capitol, head bowed, hand over heart, her shadow stretching across stone like an obelisk, drawn in silhouette. And then came the second caption. Designated strategic observer, operational level, independent, authority, Delta Autonomous. Holloway's grip on the edge of the table tightened. The metal felt soft, foreign. He was no longer standing in an interrogation room. He was standing in the crosshairs of a story he didn't author, one written years before he ever held a badge. His voice cracked under the pressure of his disbelief, forced from his lungs like smoke from an engine breaking down. Why me? Langston did not blink. She did not nod. She did not raise her voice. She simply delivered the sentence like it was a data point, unburdened by emotion, unshackled from vindication. You were the most predictable variable in the internal model. The sentence shattered everything. Holloway's legs gave out before his mind had the dignity to process it, and he collapsed backward into the chair he'd once offered her like a throne of accusation. Now, It cradled his defeat. His breathing turned shallow. The word predictable echoed through him. Not weak, not evil, not corrupted. Predictable. That meant this hadn't been personal. It had been statistical, a decision mapped out in probability and percentages, and still he had walked every step exactly as forecast. He glanced at the men from Fort Meade. They didn't look away. They didn't soften. They were simply there, the enforcers of a consequence already sealed, not by their hand, but by his actions, fed through a system that weighed conduct like currency and reflex like character. Langston took one step forward, not for intimidation, not for presence, but because the room had finally caught up to her and invited her to its center. She stood between the red and blue lights now, the hues casting a soft glow across her face, neither warm nor cold, just decisive. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her name, projected across government screens, etched into encrypted channels, carried more weight than any reprimand Holloway had ever filed. In that room, the questions were over. Only consequence remained. Holloway's mouth moved, but no words came. The cognitive dissonance was suffocating. He, who had entered this room fully convinced he held dominion over its dimensions, now reduced to a spectator in his downfall. The images kept cycling. Ribbons, medals, operations, missions buried so deep in national silence that even whispers about them required security clearance. And there she stood in every one, calm, deliberate, indomitable. She had commanded entire theaters of war with a glance. Holloway realized then what terrified him most, not that she had power, but that she never once had to raise her voice to wield it. The blue and red lights from the projection danced across her features now, casting her as neither angel nor executioner, but something else entirely, something institutional, elemental, necessary. She represented something Holloway had spent his career pretending he understood: discipline without ego, force without excess, strength without spectacle. She had become a standard not just of command, but of consequence. He tried again to speak, and this time something came through, small and cracking. I didn't know." Langston didn't react. It wasn't her job to bridge his ignorance. She was not here for closure or conversion. She was here for recognition, silent, factual, and final. From the ceiling, another image dropped into frame, a full list of awards, citations, and operations. Holloway caught flashes of code names. Some he'd heard only in the margins of black ink training modules. Others were foreign even to rumor. And next to everyone was her name. He felt like a child reading a god's resume. "What now?" he asked the room, or maybe himself. One of the Fort Meade agents turned, the first movement from any of them since the projection began. He simply said, "It's already been decided," and that was that. The walls no longer held tension. They held truth. The weight of inevitability pressed in with the same surgical stillness Langston had worn since the beginning. She hadn't chased him. She hadn't trapped him. She had waited, precisely and patiently, knowing he would march himself right into the very collapse engineered by his pattern. Holloway's eyes fell to the floor. His spine caved into itself like a structure in retreat. "It could have been someone else," he muttered. "No," she said, and it wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was simply accurate. It had to be you, because the model doesn't pick outliers. It identifies patterns. Holloway finally understood. The test had never been about her, or the badge, or the weapon, or even the system override. It had been about what he would do when everything still looked like it was under his control, when the illusion of authority gave him the confidence to reveal his core. That was the test. Not pressure, not a threat, but freedom, and what a man does with it. The screen dimmed slowly, each image retracting as though folding back into a classified vault. The last to fade was the handshake. Langston and the Secretary of Defense, hands locked in mid-Seminism, her presence framed as national weight made personal. Then, the room was silent again, just four walls and a man, unseated in every sense of the word. Langston turned to leave, her steps precise, echoing softly with gravity that didn't need announcement. As she reached the door, Holloway called after her, not with authority, but with something closer to need. "General," he said, the title clumsy in his mouth, unfamiliar and bitter. Why not someone higher, someone more visible?" She paused, not turning. Her answer came as clean as a final sentence on a classified report. "Because the higher they go, the more they're watched. But you," she turned her head slightly, "you were in the blind spot, and blind spots are where the rot begins." Then she walked out, and the door shut behind her. The door had shut with a whisper, but its silence carried the force of a sentence handed down. Holloway remained in the chair, half-slumped, face lit only by the ghostly blue flicker of a dormant screen, mind spiraling through 1,000 versions of events that had never actually been his to control. Then, without warning or command, the wall opposite him flickered to life again, no longer broadcasting military ceremony or decorum. The feed now pulsed with raw, intimate footage. Unedited, time-stamped, undeniable. It was him. The first clip showed a hallway, dimly lit and institutional. Holloway's voice echoed off the concrete walls, sharp and cutting. "She thinks being black makes her untouchable?" he barked, laughter following from someone off Fame. The audio spiked as he muttered, "One more time she mouths off, I swear I'll clock her with the back of my badge." The room didn't react. No shock. No gasp. Just a calibrated stillness that tightened like a noose with every word. The screen shifted. Now, a patrol cam played back a street-side stop. Body cam footage. Holloway's hand gripped the shoulder of a teenager, twisting him down against the hood of a car. Voice hard and mocking. "Look at you, shaking already. Bet this is the closest you've been to a clean record." The boy's voice cracked. Something about school, something about his mom. Holloway answered with a laugh and a push. Another clip. Then another, a split screen. On one side, an internal precinct meeting. Holloway slouched back in his chair, chewing gum while reading aloud from a report, pausing to mock a victim's name, mangling the syllables for comedic effect. "Maybe if she spelled it like a real citizen, I'd take it seriously." Laughter followed. On the other screen, a CCTV pull from the intake desk. Holloway walking away from a bloody detainee, muttering, "Shouldn't have mouthed." Each video had a digital watermark in the top right corner. Ethics monitor active. He looked up slowly. Langston had returned. When had she entered? It didn't matter. She stood by the wall, hands folded, posture unreadable. In her eyes was no anger. It was accountability. Cold. Precise. "You set this up," Holloway said, low and hoarse, not accusation. "I initiated it," she corrected. "For how long?" he asked. 3 months. Your conduct was reviewed retroactively. You were not informed. That was part of the design." He stood slowly, not in protest, not in defense, just to move. His voice, when it came, was brittle, but trying to stay sharp. "That footage, it's out of context. You can't assess a job like mine from a handful of—" "You're right," she cut in, voice like a scalpel through air. "That's why we didn't use a handful. We used all of it. Every patrol, every stop, every report, every decision you made when no one was watching." The screen shifted again, this time. A montage, no audio, just moment after moment. Holloway with his arms crossed as a woman pleaded in Spanish. Holloway waving off a complaint form without reading it. Holloway leaning into the ear of a young man in cuffs and whispering something that made the boy cry. Langston stepped closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, simply surgical. She opened a small digital pad in her hand, and her voice, calm, formal, began reading lines aloud. Each was followed by a time code and documentation reference. November 12th, you referred to a community member as ghetto trash on internal message logs. November 18th, you ignored a request for medical attention for over 17 minutes. December 3rd, you laughed while a 17-year-old cried during booking. December 5th, you told a junior officer, quote, "Don't waste your time with civility, just make them fear the uniform." He opened his mouth to protest, but she didn't give him space. Her voice sliced through the room. "You were not targeted, you were selected." His voice cracked again. "I followed the rules." She looked up from the pad. Her eyes didn't narrow. They didn't rise. But the air around her grew heavier. "Which rule permits the erosion of dignity?" she asked. Not rhetorical, not performative, a genuine question, one with only one honest answer. He didn't have it. The screen changed again. Now, a final frame, a line of black text on a white background. Conclusion: ethically unfit for field duty. Recommended termination. It blinked once, then locked in place. He stared at it. The weight of 3 months collapsed onto his shoulders. Not a wave, an avalanche. And through it all, she stood there, unflinching, not his enemy, not his judge, just the observer who had captured him in the act of being himself. Langston took one step forward. "We didn't create this story," she said, voice quiet but devastating. "We just recorded it." Holloway swallowed, the act dry and difficult, like trying to digest a shard of glass. His eyes drifted from the screen to the pad in her hand, then back to her face, searching for any glimmer of leniency, any crack in the wall of precision she stood behind. But there was nothing. No pity, no hatred, just the weight of what had been seen, what had been measured, what had been found lacking. "You have no idea what it's like out there," he muttered. "People lie, people push. You give them an inch, and they'll break you." Langston's face remained unreadable. Her reply was a whisper, with the density of stone. "The job doesn't excuse you, it reveals you." He took a step back, voice rising like a man trying to surface for air. "I made choices under pressure, split seconds." She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, "and that's why we recorded the spaces between the seconds." He wanted to fight it, wanted to scream, but the data had already spoken. Not twisted, not edited, just exposed. And worse than being accused of wrongdoing was realizing it hadn't taken much to prove it. No frame-ups, no traps, just reflection, cold and merciless. The footage looped quietly in the background. No sound, just images. A man in uniform choosing, again and again, where to lean when power offered options. Each clip a mirror, each one a nail. He dropped his gaze to the floor. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he said. Langston stepped closer, standing just behind the chair he had collapsed into earlier. Her voice was steady, level. Meaning doesn't cancel impact. He looked up at her, eyes glassy with something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't yet regret. "You waited for me to hang myself." "No," she said. "We waited to see if you'd stop pulling the rope." That silence, again, the same silence that had haunted every frame, every second of the last 3 months. "You could have warned me," he said, a final plea scraping through his throat. "That's not how reflex works," she replied. "Reflex doesn't wait for warning." He sat heavily, as if every muscle had surrendered to the weight of being seen. Truly, painfully seen, not in his proudest moments, but in the ones he thought no one noticed. Langston glanced back toward the screen. The white text still glowed. Ethically unfit. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't punishment. It was acknowledgement. She didn't linger. She didn't lecture. She left him with what mattered most. Himself, stripped of uniform, stripped of authority, left only with the reflection of who he had chosen to be when no one was supposed to be watching. As she turned to leave, she said one last thing, not loud, not cruel, but final. "You weren't destroyed. You were documented." The door closed behind her with a hiss of air, and in the quiet, Holloway realized the worst thing wasn't being watched. It was being understood. The broadcast hit like a silent missile, swift, systemic, untraceable, until it had already detonated. Holloway didn't hear it first. He felt it. The shift in the building's current, the ripple through secure comms, the subtle vibration of a reality being overridden. A full-screen alert overtook every monitor in the precinct. No sound, no warning, just white letters on black background. Department of Defense, Ethics, Assessment, Facility, Alpha, Segment, Complete. Subject, Brent Holloway. Result, Fail. There were no sirens, no agents bursting through the doors, No mass arrest or spectacle, just system-wide knowledge sliding into place like the final piece in a puzzle everyone had pretended wasn't real. Then it moved beyond the precinct. Internal networks across the country lit up. Police departments, field offices, security terminals, tablets, phones, badge-length watches, all pinged with the same update. Recommence termination, Brent Holloway. In a matter of seconds, the name ceased to be a badge ID and became a case file, a cautionary tale dressed in digital precision. Screens began to populate with fragments of the assessment, snapshots, evidence logs, segments of unedited footage. The clip of Holloway raising his gun in Interrogation Room 3 appeared in freeze frame across a dozen federal dashboards, annotated with time codes, metadata, and decision trees. A still image of him, mid-major, weapon raised, jaw tight, eyes full of command, he thought he still possessed, became the face of a viral thread. It spilled out from the inner networks into the public sphere, not with fanfare, but with certainty. Not leaked, released. A controlled hemorrhage. The Office of Federal Integrity issued a concise bulletin through the Defense Media Hub. Ethical evaluation under Delta-owned surveillance protocol complete. Determination: officer demonstrated sustained disregard for procedural conduct and exhibited high-risk reflex behavior in a federally monitored environment. Classification: disqualified for service, disavowed from public trust positions. A senator retweeted it with only 5 words: "No one stands above honor." The quote was picked up by newsrooms before the original statement could be fully parsed. Overnight, Holloway's name was less a name than a headline. Major outlets rolled the story into prime time. On one screen, a host calmly summarized the oversight program, quoting its rare activation clause. On another, a still of Holloway pointing his gun played in a muted loop, eyes locked in a frame that now looked less like action and more like collapse. Social channels erupted, not with outrage, but with eerie precision. It wasn't cancel culture, it wasn't fury, it was accounting. The data had spoken, and America, as it always had when power flinched under surveillance, simply listened. By dawn, the video had been embedded into 4 government ethics training modules. Within 36 hours, it became part of the new Department of Justice onboarding orientation, under the label CASE, Reflex Alpha, What Unmonitored Power Reveals. And through it all, Langston said nothing. She did not hold a press conference. She did not grant interviews. She did not issue a quote. Her silence echoed louder than any speech, because the victor does not always need to speak. Sometimes the system speaks for them. The morning after the bulletin dropped, precinct corridors buzzed with artificial calm. Conversation slowed when Holloway passed, eyes averted, not in fear, but in the sharp, unspoken acknowledgement of something irreversible. He wasn't escorted out. No one laid a hand on him. The system had already done what no confrontation could, erased his immunity. He was radioactive, not because of rumors, but because every terminal, every device in the building now knew his name, his rank, his file, and the official declaration of his failure. He moved through the building like a shadow that had lost its source of light. The bulletin had bled into the institutional marrow. Internal chat systems flagged his user ID with a gray banner that read, "Subject under termination review. Ethics violation confirmed." Every door he approached was scanned just a fraction slower. Every login attempt was met with a pause, as if the system itself was now deliberating whether he deserved access at all. And then came the broadcast. 15 seconds, aired on all secured enforcement channels. A still frame, Holloway, mid-motor, arm extended, weapon aimed at an unarmed federal operative. Overlaid text in all caps. Conduct review. Inadmissible reflex. Breach of field ethics. There was no voiceover, no context, no room for nuance, just the image and the caption. That was all it took. At a precinct in Nevada, a junior officer leaned back in his chair and closed the playback screen, muttering, "That's the guy." In Atlanta, a training officer paused her orientation slideshow and inserted the clip, telling recruits, This is why surveillance doesn't lie. In Washington, D.C., a civilian analyst turned to his supervisor and said, "They brought in Langston for that one? That's rare." And across the country, a consensus formed, not loud, not angry, but absolute. The system didn't just end Holloway's career. It absorbed it, folded it into itself like a parasite, too dangerous to be expelled. So it became instruction instead. No formal charges were filed, no handcuffs, no walk of shame. What followed was colder, sharper. On the public-facing DOJ archive, a new page went live. Brent Holloway, summary determination. Beneath it, a red seal, recommended for removal from federal service. No appeal applicable under Delta One protocol. His phone buzzed once. An automated push from the ethics board, informing him that his clearance had been downgraded, his authorization code invalidated, his retirement eligibility suspended pending full review. The email had no greeting, no signature, only a timestamp. Langston remained invisible. Her face did not appear on news cycles. Her name trended for barely an hour before dissolving back into the sea of federal silence. No quotes, no sound bites, just a perfectly executed silence that said everything. Because those who operate in the shadows of systems don't need to claim victory. They only need to reveal the truth and let the system do the rest. The room was different now, not because of anything that had changed physically, same table, same chairs, same sterile walls, but because everything that had once filled it with dominance had been hollowed out and replaced with something colder. Not defeat, not yet, something more corrosive, exposure. Holloway sat alone at the table for several minutes before the door opened. He didn't look up at first. He didn't need to. He knew who it was from the cadence of the steps. No rush, no hesitation, the kind of calm only worn by those who've seen the worst and survived it with their integrity intact. Langston. She took the seat opposite him, not to confront, not to command. She was simply present. That was enough. Between them lay a tablet and a single instruction glowing on its screen. Submit final statement for internal archiving. Self-coded, no assistance, no appeals. He stared at the words like they were in another language. His fingers twitched. Then he picked up the stylus. The first lines came fast, fueled by reflex. Training, protocol, years of polishing statements that walked the line between admission and absolution. The lines were crisp, clean, soulless. He read them once, then twice, then tore the screen from the table, pressed the deletion command, and watched the words vanish in a blink. Langston did not move. Her eyes stayed on him, not cold, not judgmental, just relentlessly aware. He tried again. This time, the writing was slower. The edges are less sharp. He began reaching, searching for phrases that might shield him from the full weight of what had been revealed. A note on pressure, a rationalization about hostile environments. He paused, stared at what he'd written, then deleted every line again. The third attempt was different, slower still, more human. He wrote about the days that blurred into each other, the faces that became statistics, the resentment that crept in, the moments he chose force when patience would have cost him nothing but pride, the pride he had spent a career guarding like a fragile throne. Midway through, his hands began to shake. He stopped writing. He looked at her and broke. No sobs, no theatrics, just silent tears, sharp, exposed, the kind a man sheds when the weight of truth has crushed the space where denial once lived. He didn't hide it. He didn't wipe his face. He just sat there, breath ragged, undone by the one thing he could no longer argue with. Langston spoke for the first time in what felt like years. "You were trained to identify threats," she said, each word delivered with the softness of a final incision. "But you became one." His jaw flexed, something between resistance and acceptance. "Did you ever see potential in me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't hesitate. "Yes, but potential without ethics is ammunition without aim." He nodded slowly, the weight of her words pushing his gaze back to the table. Then, almost defiantly, he placed the stylus down, looked her in the eye, and said, "I'm not going to apologize." Her reply was immediate. Good. Because an apology doesn't restore honor. It only acknowledges the absence of it. That landed harder than any insult ever could. There was nothing left to say. Langston stood, slow and deliberate, the way someone stands when their presence has done what words never could. She turned, walked to the door, paused, not to look back, but to let the silence sink in like the final line of a verdict. Then she walked out. The door slid shut behind her with the same quiet finality as a closing vault. Holloway remained seated, hands limp in his lap, eyes hollow. Behind him, one of the wall lights began to flicker, not in malfunction, but in programmed pattern, a slow, red pulse, like a heartbeat, or a warning, or the last signal that a name had ceased to carry meaning. Time passed, but Holloway couldn't say how much. The room seemed stuck in its orbit, beyond clocks, beyond routines. The red light continued its pulse, as if counting down the echoes of a man who had once believed he was untouchable. He stared at the blank screen in front of him, now reset, offering one last chance to speak, to shape his legacy, to soften the blow history would deliver. But what could he say? That he had meant well? That he had done what the job required? Was that sometimes rage was easier than restraint? Those lines had all been used before, by men in suits, behind podiums, speaking into cameras that didn't flinch. But Holloway wasn't in front of a camera. He was alone, in a room that had become a mirror. He pressed the stylus to the screen again. This time, he didn't try to craft a statement. He wrote as if it didn't matter who read it, as if the only person who needed to see it was the one who could no longer lie to himself. I was afraid of silence, he wrote. I filled it with noise, orders, reports, justifications. I became louder when I felt smaller. I chose commands over questions because I thought authority required volume. I never thought silence would be what judged me. But she sat across from me, said nothing, and I unraveled. He paused, then deleted it. Not because it wasn't true, but because the truth no longer needed to be declared. It had already been witnessed. He stood. The room didn't stop him. No alert, no restraints. It didn't need to anymore. He walked to the door and placed his palm against the glass. It didn't open. There was no signal to leave. There had never been. This wasn't a cell. It was a conclusion. He returned to the chair, sat. This was not a man waiting for rescue. This was a man realizing there was none. From a ceiling vent, the sound of conditioned air murmured in cycles, mocking the stillness. Somewhere deep in the wall, servers hummed, a distant chorus of data being stored, cross-referenced, judged. Holloway's name was no longer in bold on the screens. It had receded into the background, cataloged not as a profile, but a caution. Langston's chair remained where she'd left it, pushed back slightly, tilted just so, as if she had never needed it to lean on. He remembered her eyes, not angry, not even disappointed. They were reflective, like water undisturbed, showing him his face stripped of all story. No medals, no ranks, no code names, just a man, a failed one. The screen flickered once, as if preparing to log the silence as testimony, and maybe that was the only appropriate ending. Not a report, not a file, but a gap, a space where arrogance had once lived. The door behind him did not open, but something else did. In him, a stillness, cold, unrelenting, absolute. The kind that comes when you've lost everything except the memory of what you were supposed to be. The silence that followed Langston's final words clung to the room like smoke, dense and unshakable. Holloway sat motionless, back straight as if bracing for an impact that had already passed. Outside the glass walls of the debriefing chamber, no one waited. No protocol officer, no department representative, no exit interview. There was only the sound of his breath and the thin scratch of pen against form as the supervisor across from him filled out the last requisition. The Glock was already gone, taken from his side holster with the precision of habit and stripped without ceremony. His badge followed, dropped into a steel tray like it carried contamination. His ID card, plastic, chipped at the edge, unremarkable, was sliced in two and discarded. The uniform shirt, once starched and pressed with rank, now folded and sealed in a standard issue bag. All of it was removed with a clinical efficiency that ignored the man it once belonged to. He was no longer Sergeant Brent Holloway of the Civil Zone Enforcement Bureau. That designation had already been deleted from the system. 12 seconds. That's how long it took. A digital purge streamed across the overhead monitor. Red slashes marking the disappearance of every credential tied to his name. Firearm licensure terminated. Field access code nullified. Internal network presency revoked. System identity erased. The final status tag blinked coldly in a corner. Designation transferred to observation registry. No appeal, no footnote, no explanation. Just a disappearance, bureaucratic and absolute. The supervisor looked up only once, offering no condolences, no reassurance. Just a line said with mechanical finality, "That's it." Holloway blinked. "So, I'm not anything anymore?" The man didn't flinch. "No, you're just yourself." He stepped out into the hallway with the steps of a man who no longer cast a shadow. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too loud, too sterile. People passed him, but didn't stop, not even a glance, not even the instinctive nod officers used to exchange in passing. It was as though he'd never been part of them, as though he'd never worn the badge, never barked orders, never shoved his way through interrogations with the weight of a system behind him. They avoided his eyes like his very presence threatened to spread, a contagion of consequence. The man who failed the test, no one told him was happening. He reached the clearance checkpoint and stood before the scanner. The machine didn't beep, it didn't flash, it didn't even blink. Just a flat red bar with the message, "Access denied." The guard didn't move. "You'll need to exit through the public lobby," he said without emotion. Holloway stared, jaw tight, but didn't argue. There was no rank to summon, no command to give, just the echo of his silence. Down the corridor, he spotted the last person he ever expected, Langston. Not standing, not speaking, just calmly signing a final authorization form, the final confirmation of his identity loss. The pen glided with precision. Her posture was straight, her face is unreadable. When she turned to him, there was no satisfaction in her eyes, no gloating, just a stare sharp enough to shave a man to the bone. "From this moment," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "you are not being monitored. You are being remembered." He opened his mouth, but the words dried before reaching his tongue. She turned and walked away, boots silent, back straight, coat immaculate. He walked past the reception desk, down the stairs, out the side entrance, where no ceremony awaited. Just the raw sun and the wind that had nothing to say to him. On the outside wall of the precinct, the digital display that once rolled names of on-duty officers flickered and refreshed. His name didn't appear, not at the bottom, not even in the archives. Gone, deleted, rewritten out of relevance. And in its place, at the very top, a single notice blinked in white. National Discredited Registered, entry confirmed. Inside the data center, rows of screens are updated in real time. One file, previously restricted and compartmentalized, had been transferred to open watch mode. Brent Holloway, public surveillance enabled. No alarm, no detail, just a quiet protocol shift, a systemic declaration. The system no longer trusts him to wear its colors, but will never stop watching where his shadow might fall. The irony crushed in with deliberate force. The enforcer turned the enforcer. The interrogator, who once made men tremble, now stood exposed with nowhere to press back. No rank, no reputation, no refuge. His personal belongings were returned in a cardboard box, handed off without eye contact. Wallet, phone, keys, a worn notebook with the corners curled in. No one had added a note. No one had signed a farewell. He stood in the parking lot, gripping the box like it might disintegrate. It wasn't just the items, it was what they meant now. Proof. He was just another man with no name above the line, no clearance past the threshold, no voice louder than the traffic humming in the distance. As he opened the car door, his phone vibrated. One last notification. Not from a friend, not from a superior, from a federal feed marked Unsubscribed access. The message read simply, "All system privately revoked. No further correspondence permitted." His fingers hovered over the screen, then slowly powered the device off. The black mirror returned his reflection. Eyes no longer shielded by the badge. Shoulders no longer bearing institutional weight. Just a man, stripped bare by truth. And the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the world was done whispering his name. Langston, elsewhere, signed the final field evaluation. Her signature is clean, precise, and final. The box next to his name now read, "Ethical response, failure, non-recoverable." She did not look back. She did not explain. There was nothing left to teach a man who refused to learn when it mattered. The silence inside the hearing chamber was so deep it had texture, a vacuum pressed tight against the skin. Holloway stepped into the space like a man already halfway erased, the soles of his shoes tapping against the polished floor with an eerie lack of purpose. No bailiff announced his entrance. No panel of judges sat in the arc of authority. Instead, a single semicircle of high-backed chairs remained unoccupied, their leather untouched, cold. At the center of the wall behind them, a massive screen came to life without prompt, filling the chamber with harsh, unblinking light. The screen displayed the heading, "Behavioral Oversight Review, Case, Brent Holloway." As he moved to the center, a podium rose mechanically from the floor. A terminal glowed blue before him, ready to accept his final defense. But he didn't begin typing. Not yet. He looked up at the screen again, and that's when the footage began. No narration, no edits. Just raw sequence. The first video was from his body cam, dated 74 days ago. It showed him shouting at a suspect, barely 16 years old, face down on the pavement, cuffed, bleeding from the lip. Holloway's voice on the recording was calm, but its content dripped venom. Act like a punk, get treated like one. There was no need for interpretation. His tone condemned itself. Another video. This one, an internal meeting. Private, off the record. Holloway was laughing, recounting an arrest. He imitated a woman's scream in mockery, and others in the room chuckled until the feed froze on his smirk. Then came a side-by-side comparison. The official report he filed, next to the actual footage. Discrepancies scrolled like credits, language used, injuries sustained. The AI overlay highlighted each lie in red. No judge needed. The truth was algorithmic, undeniable. Holloway swallowed, the taste of dry copper rising in his throat. Still, he stood straight, as if posture might compensate for character. Behind the silence, sensors were working, measuring blood pressure, iris dilation, and micro-expressions. Everything was data now, and data. Next, the screen showed the freeze frame, the infamous moment. Holloway, with his gun raised, barrel aimed directly at Langston's forehead. The digital measurement burned bright. Distance, 11.2 cms. The visual zoomed in on his trigger finger, trembling, and then on his right hand, slightly recoiled, the muscle twitch exposed. Then to Langston, who remained seated, pulse flat, eyes fixed on him like a blade. A new line of data blinked over her image. Subject, response. No fear detected. No one in the room spoke, but someone was taking notes. A figure far in the corner, head down, pen flicking across a tablet. Not a judge, not a jury, just a recorder of truths too raw for legal framing. Holloway tried to clear his throat, but it made no sound. He finally reached for the terminal, typed one sentence. "I was doing my job." The screen paused. A message blinked, "Justify." He looked up again. Langston sat silently in the front row, unmoving, unblinking. Her presence felt less like judgment, more like a mirror, polished to brutal clarity. She didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't offer sympathy, didn't gloat. She simply existed, untouched, irrefutable. Holloway typed again. "I acted according to protocol. A new video has been loaded. A different officer, same situation. De-escalation successful. No force used." The screen superimposed a line. "Comparable incident, resolved without violence." The machine did not accuse, It didn't need to. It merely contrasted. He leaned forward, knuckles whitening against the podium. "There are variables in the field," he typed. "Unknowns. I had to be ready." The screen filled with transcript excerpts. His own words over months, compiled, racial slurs, dismissals of complaints, orders given without cause. Every statement is time-stamped, location-tagged, and admissible. AI voice synthesis replayed a few lines aloud in a loop, his voice unmistakable. "They all lie the same. One look and you know the type. Don't need a trial if you've got good instincts." A soft click broke the rhythm. The note-taker in the corner stood and handed a printout to a terminal beside the screen. It scanned, validated. The heading blinked. Character summary, subject, Holloway. Beneath, one line, systemic deviation from code of conduct, pattern misuse of authority, ethically unfit for duty. Holloway stepped back. He could feel his breath bouncing off the chamber walls. Echoes without substance. He turned toward Langston, voice rasping from disuse. "I used to think I was strong." The note-taker looked up and said, without venom, "You used to think wrong." Silence followed. But it was no longer a silence of absence. It was full, weighty, the way a final page sits before being turned. Langston rose, her chair moving back with a muted scrape. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. She walked past him with the grace of inevitability. At the threshold, she paused for the briefest instant, then continued forward, leaving only that last question ringing in the chamber, not spoken but felt. What strength is it that fears the truth? The room had gone cold long before Holloway stepped outside it. The air no longer followed him, nor did the silence that once trailed behind his uniform. Now there was only noise, digital, relentless, and sharp. It started as a ping on a low-traffic forum, then surged into a storm that no algorithm could suppress. The video had gone viral. Freeze-framed at the moment his Glock hovered 11 centimeters from her forehead, her face unreadable, his eyes wide with misplaced fury, it replayed across the nation. From handhelds to overhead news feeds, the truth bled out into pixels. Not as a confession, but as evidence. There was no caption, no commentary, just the raw moment of a system, personified in him, trying to assert power it no longer owned. On a downtown LED billboard in Chicago, a looping message flashed over and over again above a sea of silent commuters. "Do you know who this officer has threatened?" The image faded to show his badge photo, then dissolved into a crowd-sourced collage of incidents, testimonies, and timestamps. Beneath it, people began to stop. Not to chant, not to rage, just to look and remember. A podcast titled Truth Without a Uniform surged to the top of national charts overnight. Its hosts, two veterans of protest journalism, invited former victims of unjustified detainment to speak. They offered Langston a platform. She declined. Her only response was a one-line email. The truth already spoke. That sentence, short and sharp, became a trending hashtag within hours. Across cities, once ignored files were reopened. People who had once been cuffed without cause, humiliated without process, began writing. Letters flooded prosecutorial inboxes. Formal complaints were now laced with video evidence, some damning, some quietly devastating. Each piece contributed to a mosaic no one could unsee. One letter stood out, a scanned drawing by a 7-year-old child, once handcuffed outside a library during an identification misfire. The drawing showed a tall figure with a badge and a frown looming over a crying stick figure. In red crayon, the caption read, "I was scared of him." In another city, Holloway stepped into a diner, weary and disoriented, still wearing civilian clothes that didn't seem to belong on him. He ordered coffee. The server returned minutes later with no cup, just a check. Across the top, handwritten in ink darker than the printed line items, it read, "We don't serve unlawful orders." He left the bill unpaid and walked out, eyes burning, not from emotion, but from the weight of being seen. He tried to blend in. He shaved. He changed his walk, he avoided mirrors, but the digital world had no backstreets. Facial recognition tagged him quietly. Retail systems flagged him silently. He was no longer flagged as dangerous. That might have been simpler. Instead, he was marked as known, as recorded, as remembered. At one university, in a lecture on systemic conduct codes and the psychology of authority, a professor played a silent 12-second loop, Holloway aiming, Langston unmoved. He asked the class, "What do you see?" One student said, "A man about to destroy his career." Another replied, "A woman who already knew she wouldn't have to stop him." At a street art fair, an anonymous piece appeared on a brick wall canvas, a stencil of Langston's silhouette, upright, powerful, walking away from a crumpled uniform on the ground. Below it, painted in white, "We're not afraid of your badge, we're afraid of who's behind it." The artist never signed it. They didn't need to. And yet through it all, Langston said nothing more. No interviews, no memoirs, no podiums. Her silence was surgical. She allowed the world to chew on the footage, the files, the fall. She gave it no sugar, no context, no cushion. The absence of her voice became louder than any rebuttal could have been. Holloway's former colleagues stopped replying to his texts. Some had already unfollowed him, others simply blocked him. In internal threads, his name was now referenced only in procedural footnotes. Refer to incident HLW 43 Gamma for protocol deviation. Even those who once defended him now whispered of reputation risk. He was not officially blacklisted, but no department would take him, not even for desk duty. One precinct memo put it bluntly: avoid association until Federal Ethics Board concludes review. At home, he received mail, some anonymous, some signed. One envelope held a burned copy of a departmental manual with his name redacted in black marker. Another contained a photo of him at a protest 2 years ago, laughing behind a riot helmet. The back read, "Still funny?" He didn't throw it away. He didn't burn it either. He just put it in the bottom drawer and never opened it again. Children who had once waved at patrol cars now turned their heads. Their parents didn't need to explain why. In neighborhoods he used to cruise through with the weight of authority in his voice, doors no longer opened. If he knocked, they stayed shut. If he waited, nothing happened. The silence wasn't passive, it was chosen. Online, a vigil page emerged. Not for a death, but for public trust. Thousands of people posted their own stories, tagging them under categories like misuse, mocked, and unseen. His name appeared repeatedly, not as a villain, but as a trigger, a reminder, an echo of when power forgot its purpose. At a memorial event for victims of police overreach, a speaker read names, not of the fallen, but of those who walked away humiliated. One name wasn't read aloud. It didn't need to be. It hovered above the stage, looped in background footage frozen in time. Brent Holloway's face. In that precise frame, the one where he realized he was no longer feared, played in slow motion, again and again. Langston, though invited, didn't attend. Her absence was a choice. It preserved the silence. It let the moment belong to those who'd lived in his shadow, a shadow he never noticed until it consumed him. On a sidewalk outside the courthouse where it all began, someone had spray-painted a quote in black letters. "You weren't judged, you were recorded." Next to it, someone added a smaller line in chalk, "And we don't forget." The chamber that once echoed with defense and denial now pulsed with something heavier, revelation. It wasn't loud, it didn't scream. It moved through the room like a tide finally returning to claim what had always belonged to it. On the main screen, a document unfolded. Not grainy surveillance, not predictive metadata. This time, it was paper, ink, a signature, dated September 8th, 2005. Its header bore the insignia of the National Officer Evaluation Board, and beneath that, in clean block font, application for disciplinary record expungement, Cadet Brent Holloway. The stamp across the bottom corner said everything the room needed to know. Denied. A military investigator stepped forward, holding a copy of the document with the reverence of a relic. "This," he said, his voice even, "is the moment the future was warned." The camera panned across the faces in the room, and no one flinched. The screen zoomed in on the body of the letter. The wording was cold, deliberate, and surgical in tone. After thorough evaluation, the committee concludes that the applicant has not demonstrated the ethical maturity required for reinstatement. Authority is not a skill. It is a responsibility, power granted without the prerequisite of truth-facing results in predictable misuse. This office recommends no advancement or clearance be granted until the applicant proves capable of accountability under pressure. It was signed Major General Rose Marie Langston. A pause stretched. No gasp, no murmur. Just a sudden alignment of timelines, a tightening thread across 2 decades finally pulled taut. One of the members of the Ethics Oversight Board shook his head and muttered under his breath, but the microphone caught it. She was right. All this time. Holloway, seated again with nothing left to brace himself against, stared up at the letter. It glowed across the wall like a sentence that had just learned to speak. He blinked, slowly, like a man reading his epitaph. "So," he said quietly, "you already saw it." That long ago. Langston, who had not stood since the hearing began, finally looked at him, not with fury, not even disappointment, only with that unrelenting clarity that had followed him since the moment her name entered his file. "I didn't see it," she said. "I read it. You wrote it yourself." He leaned back, eyes locked on the screen. "I should have known you back then." Her answer landed like a hammer chiseled from granite. "I wasn't hiding my name. You were hiding your eyes." In the silence that followed, the rest of the room adjusted itself. Chairs shifted, someone cleared a throat, but no one broke the spell. The weight of consequence no longer needed force. It had gravity now, historic, permanent. Outside, the same document appeared in media archives, cross-referenced with Holloway's disciplinary records, which had once been sealed under training anomalies. Journalists dissected it line by line. Analysts tied it to a pattern that had always existed, just unacknowledged. His first warning had been written in plain sight. The system hadn't failed. It had spoken. The failure was in the refusal to listen. On a federal live stream, the document was read aloud as part of a public education series on ethical foresight. Students listened, educators debated, and in one classroom a single phrase was etched on a whiteboard. "Don't promote what you're too afraid to inspect." That line was underlined twice. No attribution, but the implication bled through. Holloway, now stripped of pretense and surrounded by the full echo of choices once dismissed as moments, didn't protest. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't argue timelines or bias or hidden motives. He simply sat in the stillness that follows recognition. Langston, as always, did not offer rescue. She didn't explain the origins of her words. She didn't soften their edge for the sake of his fall. She let the past speak for itself, because that's what history does. It waits, patient, silent, then strikes with the sharpness of hindsight. Ethics Board concluded its session without a vote. There was no need. The record had already been written. The man had already unmasked himself. The hallway was long, lined with mirrors that didn't reflect. It sat under the bones of an old federal building, granite, brass, and echoes of too many oaths made too casually. The crowd from the ethics tribunal had dispersed hours ago, leaving only their conclusions behind. There were no cameras here, no reporters, just a stretch of tile and time, with no destination but the moment. Holloway stood at the far end, no longer in uniform, no longer nameless either. The system had stopped announcing him, but it hadn't stopped watching. He carried no weapon, no badge, no plea, just the weight of what had not been said in rooms that judged without ever raising a voice. Langston was waiting halfway down, standing in front of a tall, blank wall like it was a window only she could see through. She hadn't moved in 10 minutes. She didn't turn when he approached. His steps were slow, deliberate, not hesitant, just stripped of privilege. When he finally stood beside her, the space between them was thick with unasked questions. "I'm not here for forgiveness," he said, his voice dry from disuse, "and I know you don't offer redemption." She still didn't look at him. "So why did you come?" Her tone was even, precise. He hesitated. "I didn't know where else to go." "That's not a reason," she said. and still didn't blink. There was a silence so deep it peeled back the layers of posture. Finally, he asked, "Is there anything left I can do?" Only then did she move. Reaching into the inside pocket of her coat, she pulled out a folded slip of paper, handed it to him without ceremony. 9 names were typed, spaced cleanly, with one line beneath. Listen to each one. No defense, no justification, just hear them. He stared at the list, then at her. "To make it right?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "Not to erase. Just not to forget." Her words cut with the softness of granite, aged, unmoved, absolute. He nodded. It was all he could do. A small motion that said he understood there was no re-entry, only reckoning. His eyes welled, but he didn't wipe them. He stood still, letting the water fall as a consequence. Langston turned. She didn't look back. Her pace didn't quicken, didn't slow. She disappeared around the corner, like she was never meant to be seen leaving, only arriving, always arriving, when truth required a name. From a hidden corner near the ceiling, a camera blinked red. It recorded their meeting in full, but the footage was not uploaded. It wasn't aired, it was stored. Not for trials, not for headlines, just for history. It began as a shutter click. Not a planned photograph, not a commemorative capture, just the uninvited blink of a lens in a hallway where silence still hung like consequence. The light hit the floor unevenly, filtered through old glass and institutional shadow, and caught 2 figures on either end of a line that would never reconnect. Langston stood upright, shoulders square beneath a pristine white uniform, not defiant, not triumphant, just anchored. Holloway faced her, his head bowed, not as a gesture, but as gravity. Between them, the stretch of tile held the echo of everything they didn't say. Their shadows went in opposite directions. The photo had no watermark, no caption, no timestamp. It simply appeared online, first on a small ethics blog, then reposted with the understated title, "National Silence." No one claimed authorship, no one needed to. It was the kind of image that didn't ask for credit because it had already become something bigger than proof. It became a metaphor. It spread faster than any file that had come before it. Not viral in a sensational way, viral in a systemic way, embedded into textbooks, screensavers at government agencies, slide presentations in ethics seminars. No need for exposition, no room for spin. It was interpretation proof. A single frame that said everything about what happens when power kneels, not because it's noble, but because it's been disarmed by the truth. In classrooms, students paused longer at that slide. Teachers didn't narrate. They waited, instead, to see who would speak first. Some never did. Others asked, "Which one is the hero?" only to realize the answer wasn't the point. What mattered was the posture, one upright, one bold, both caught in the same light yet casting different shadows. In a small studio in Baltimore, a young artist stared at the image for 6 straight hours, then began painting, not with replication in mind, but interpretation. Each stroke thick with silence, each layer of white overlaid with gray, not to blur, but to remind. When it was done, the canvas stood 6 feet tall. It was installed weeks later in the central atrium of the Institute of Justice Memory, a hall that until then had displayed mostly legal texts and video clips. But this image required no sound, no sentence, no statute. It replaced paragraphs with posture, argument with absorption. The visitors stood in front of the painting for long minutes. Some nodded, some wept, some just stared until their phones buzzed them back into motion. Beneath the frame was a small plaque that read only. The line between title and truth is this thin. Langston received a formal letter requesting permission to sell reproductions of the painting for civic education programs. She declined. In her reply, typed and hand-signed, she wrote, "I do not own light. I do not license silence." Journalists tried to get a comment. She refused. One reporter asked if she was proud to be the image's centerpiece. She replied, "I was never the center, just the constant." There was a national symposium that year on systemic reform. At its keynote, instead of a speech, Organizers projected the image on a full auditorium screen. The room darkened. No one spoke, and for 6 minutes, the silence said more than any panel ever could. Even in protest circles, the image took on nuance. Some saw it as a reckoning, others as a reminder that posture alone is not penance, but no one denied its presence. It didn't demand agreement, it just refused to be ignored. Holloway, when shown the image in an anonymous message sent to his account, didn't respond. He didn't share it. He didn't delete it. He just stared for 35 minutes, then turned off the screen. That night, he sat on his porch with the paper Langston had given him. 9 names. Still waiting to be heard. The photograph wasn't archived by any federal museum. It was archived by memory, uploaded by thousands, screenshotted by millions, etched into policy debates without ever being cited directly. It became the silent witness that no one could cross-examine. Later, at a forum discussing image and justice, a sociologist called it the most articulate moment in recent civic history without a single spoken word. An archivist added, "We used to frame declarations, now we frame reflection." Still, Langston never stepped into the light of its aftermath. She continued her work off-grid, reviewing conduct patterns and response metrics, rarely making public appearances, always choosing documents over dialogue. When asked again to narrate her sides, she simply replied, "There are no sides, just directions." In that image, those directions had already been spoken. She looks to the future. He went to the past. And the hallway, endless, still held space for anyone else deciding which way they'd walk next. The hall was quiet, not because it demanded reverence, but because everyone inside knew that silence was already part of the language here. It wasn't built for applause. It had no banners, no lights, no press boxes. Just rows of plain seats facing a modest lectern and one line on the screen behind it. The unremembered. There were no invitations, only coordinates and a time. Those who came did so because they had been waiting for a place where truth didn't require permission. When he took another step backward, and there the bodyguard was frozen, lined in faint uniform, not decorated, not framed by authority, only flanked by purpose. Her presence was composed, but not ceremonial. She looked across the room at faces weathered by verdicts and headlines they hadn't written. Veterans, survivors of wrongful detention, civil rights attorneys, public defenders and medical examiners who had signed off on the aftermath of force, and in the back row someone who had once been cuffed for crossing a street too slowly. She cleared her throat once, not for effect, but to begin. "If I hadn't worn a ribbon that day," she said, "I would have been shot." There was no gasp, just breath held across dozens of bodies, each one carrying a version of that truth. Not hypothetical, historical, lived, she continued. "That's not speculation, that's arithmetic. I've done the numbers, I've seen the footage. I've written the reports." A hand rose halfway down the row. It belonged to a woman in her 60s, her voice steady. "And if you hadn't spoken up," she said, "no one would have believed people like us." Langston didn't reply right away. The comment didn't require embellishment. It just stood, intact. Eventually, she nodded. "That's why I called this gathering, not to speak for, to speak with." They moved through testimonies. One by one, a man recalled the floor of a jail cell in winter, skin frozen to metal, charged with obstruction for asking a question. A teenager described the sound of a taser being unholstered while he was still holding his school bag. A nurse spoke of the time she was detained in scrubs after a 12-hour shift because her ID badge didn't scan fast enough. There were no visuals, no slides, no statistics, only voices, and each one landed like a weight onto the floorboards of collective knowing. Not performance, not politics. Proof. Then, as planned, they stood, all of them, in silence. 1 full minute for those whose names were never entered into reports. never featured in statements, never made it into hashtags. They weren't forgotten. They were never recorded to begin with. Langston closed the tribute with the quiet precision of someone who understood what not to say. Then she spoke, not from a script, but from that same reservoir where her resolve had always drawn power. "I say these things," she said, "not to be heard, but so that someone else doesn't stay silent forever." There was no applause, only understanding, the kind that doesn't echo, it anchors. The conference room on the 5th floor of the Pentagon had been designed for gravity, every light fixture calibrated, every angle of the oval table engineered to focus power inward. Seats are arranged with nameplates. Documents are pre-aligned with precision. Security detail present but invisible. The topic for the day was institutional reform, again, but this time there was something new. Not on the agenda, not in the talking point, just one chair. The chair was the same as the others. Ergonomic, leather, military grade, but no one touched it. In front of it, the nameplate read, Brent Holloway. It sat dead center on the south curve of the table, a spot typically reserved for those expected to answer. Nobody filled it. No voice was prepared to speak from it. Instead, on the cushion lay a small, folded placard. Its message was short, sharp, and unarguable. Do not let your name sit where someone withdrew from humanity. People filed into the room, slowly. No one asked about the chair. No one dared move it. They simply adjusted around its presence the way one does with absence when it's earned. A few murmurs floated in, recognition, memory, discomfort, but they dissolved as the first speaker began outlining proposed procedural updates to use of force accountability. Charts flickered on screens. Metrics were shared. But every time someone's eyes wandered, they landed on that chair, not haunted, held. The silence around it was curated, intentional. It wasn't about shame, it was about memory that refused to be neutralized. Halfway through the session, a staff aide approached the podium and quietly slid a note card to the current speaker. They paused, read, and nodded once. Then they looked up at the audience and said, "There's a note that's just arrived from General Langston. I've been asked to read it aloud." The air tightened like a sealed chamber. The speaker read, "I once thought I might one day forgive. Then I remembered the look in his eyes. No elaboration, no signature, no elaborative pause. The words just hung there, raw and intact, like a truth someone had left unfiltered. No one responded. There was nothing to defend, no counterpoint to raise, no philosophical detour to blur the edge of what had just been said. The room, packed with policymakers, analysts, officers, and legal minds, sat still. Hands that usually took notes rested, laptops that usually clicked shut quietly. A statement like that doesn't leave room for multitasking. The camera mounted on the ceiling rotated slowly, methodically. As it moved across the perimeter of the room, it passed over portfolios, strategic diagrams, and name tags. Then it stopped, directly above the empty chair. The live feed continued, silent and uncaptioned, streaming to a secure archive where it would be kept, not shared. The gesture was deliberate. The visual was the memo. There were no breaks in that session. No one left early. When lunch came, it was boxed and silent. Attendees sat with their thoughts, eating without appetite. The kind of stillness that follows exposure, not exhaustion. Later, a representative from Ethics Oversight rose and read a portion of a previously sealed transcript from Holloway's disciplinary file. The words were procedural, but the subtext was undeniable. Non-compliant with adaptive empathy protocols, exhibited defensive obstruction when presented with reflective documentation, not poetic, but damning. No one defended him, not even those who once had. The chair had done the speaking. It would later be reported that several agencies requested replicas of the setup for internal training spaces. The Department of Public Safety began circulating an internal memo recommending symbolic presence indicators in executive decision rooms. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was unmistakable. A university ethics class recreated the room for a capstone seminar, a simulation in which one chair was always left empty. The students were told, "This is not a ghost story. It's a cautionary tale without a narrator." Langston never entered that room. She never stood before the table, but her voice, 12 words long, outlasted every report printed that day. No formal verdict was issued. No press conference followed, no award ceremony for a moral victory. What stood, what stayed, was that one unclaimed seat. And in a city built on occupancy and rank, that vacancy screamed. The sky was pale and indifferent when she stepped out of the transport, a modest vehicle, unmarked, silent in its arrival and departure. No salutes, no shadows trailing her steps, just the soft crunch of gravel under boots that no longer belonged to a system, only to the ground. The house stood just as she left it. Modest, one-story, vinyl siding dulled with age, but intact, like her. Nothing gleamed, but everything endured. Langston carried a simple canvas duffel. Its weight had nothing to do with mass. She opened the screen door slowly, with the kind of care that said not everything that closes must slam. The hinges didn't creak. They knew her. Inside, the air held no smell of dust or neglect. It was as if the place had been waiting, not as a monument, but as a witness too long silent. She walked down the short hallway and entered the back room. No lights turned on. She didn't need them. The curtains were drawn, and the sun angled in with enough softness not to disturb anything that still remembered her touch. She placed the duffel on the old oak bench beneath the coat hooks. Then she unzipped it. One by one she removed the garments, not tossed, not dropped, lifted, folded, pressed with palms as if tucking memory into the seams. The jacket first, white with crisp creases, bearing no rank insignia anymore. Then the inner layers, blouse and slacks, each one placed over a thick hanger with the exactitude of someone who never believed in shortcuts. The gloves came last. They had touched power. They had carried more than their fabric should have been able to bear. She laid them beside the uniform and stepped back. On the wall was a metal hook. That was where it always went. Not displayed, not spotlighted, just suspended, like a chapter finished, but not erased. Next came the box, wooden, smooth. The mahogany varnish had long faded. She opened a drawer from the cabinet and drew it out with both hands. It had no lock code, no retina scanner, only a tiny brass key that hung from a red thread tied around a nail above her bed. She untied it, slotted it into the latch, and turned. Inside sat the Delta One card, untouched, untarnished, still pulsing faintly with its embedded sensor, though no device now waited to receive it. She looked at it for a moment, not like a relic, but like a reminder. Then she placed it gently in the center of the felt-lined compartment, as if returning a blade to its sheath. She closed the lid, turned the key, removed it, tied it back on the nail. A quiet rustle came from the living room. She turned her head, but didn't rush. The sound was old and familiar. Nails on linoleum, breath slowing near the threshold, a low whine of greeting. Then, from behind the sofa, the old shepherd hobbled forward, tail thudding against the couch. Half-hearted but full of recognition, Langston kneeled, not stiffly, not ceremoniously, just lowered herself until their eyes met, and her fingers ran behind his ears like they used to. He licked her hand once, no demand, just acknowledgement. She whispered, not as a command or confession, but as a conclusion, "It's done." The dog settled next to her, chin resting on her knee. Outside, the sound of tires on gravel, small ones, plastic-wrapped, cheap, fast, buzzed past the front yard. She stood, walked to the window. A child, black, maybe 7, wobbled on a hand-me-down bicycle, knees too long for the frame, laughter trailing behind like a ribbon. He saw her in the window, waved, no words, just eyes and teeth bright in the morning light. She didn't wave back. She didn't need to. She looked, fully, and held his gaze just long enough for it to land. Then she stepped back, closed the curtain, walked to the door, closed it behind her. No one recorded her arrival. No one would broadcast the scene. It didn't need syndication. Some endings don't crescendo. They simply arrive, stand, and stay. It began as a quiet submission, a column buried in the middle of Justice Quarterly, between procedural updates and behavioral studies. It bore no banner, no byline that shouted authority, just a name, Cadet M.R. Jenkins, and a title that was more observation than tribute, the woman who didn't blink when the gun was raised, and what that changed in us. The first paragraph was clinical. The cadet recounted their experience at the academy, where training modules included a 15-second clip paused at frame 1012, the exact moment Holloway's Glock hovered 11 centimeters from Langston's brow. They had watched that frame more than 24 times. The instructors never offered an interpretation. They only asked questions. Most cadets avoided the woman's gaze. Some stared at the muzzle. A few looked only at Holloway's trembling wrist, but the author of the article confessed to something different. I didn't study the weapon. I studied her eyelids. They never moved. Not a flinch, not a wince, just vision, unbroken. Before that frame became doctrine, it was a rumor, a myth of motionlessness passed down like a secret, not because it needed hiding, but because it demanded digestion. It resurfaced not through press conferences or tribunal verdicts, but in the form of a leaked internal memo, printed with low toner and left taped to a precinct locker. Subject: Holloway B. Access to city facilities is suspended pending public security review. No one signed it. No one needed to. It didn't come down for 3 weeks, not because the protocol was unclear, but because no one wanted to touch it. 3 blocks from that precinct, a mural, once commissioned to honor distinguished service, was painted over in a single night. The public statement read maintenance, but residents knew better, especially those who saw the new outline emerge by dawn. Not a face, not even a figure, just a pair of closed eyes with the word unseen painted underneath. In another city, at the edge of a disciplinary symposium, a delegate from Internal Affairs found a seat with a sealed envelope taped beneath. Inside, a printed still of the frame, the gun, the stare, the unbearable nearness, and a post-it: "You trained us to shoot. She trained us to see." It wasn't signed, but the handwriting belonged to someone who'd once passed every firearm certification with distinction. The conference went on. No comment was made, but the envelope was never turned in. Holloway, meanwhile, had become a name spoken through tight jaws, not out of fear but fatigue. In the same week, his application to serve as a private consultant was denied in 3 states without a hearing, and someone erected a glass case in the entryway of a small-town public library. It held only one object: an empty holster with a caption underneath, "When power forgets its reflection." There were jokes, of course. Late-night hosts thrived on the symmetry of it all. One clip opened with a mock training video, "How Not to Blink," a guide by Brent Holloway. The crowd roared, not because it was funny, but because the silence was heavier. Another segment parodied the infamous footage by replacing the Glock with a pointing finger and overlaying captions like, "The real threat." But even those who laughed found themselves quieting at the same spot, frame 112, when her eyes held, and kept holding. It wasn't until a podcast aired, hosted by a retired officer turned ethics professor, that the phrase post-traumatic authority disorder entered the discourse. The host didn't define it. She only asked, "What do we do when the enforcers forget to enforce restraint?" Her guest, a psychologist, cited the Holloway footage and called it a moment when instinct failed to outrun dignity. For weeks, Holloway's mail was returned unopened. Employment inquiries went unacknowledged. Eventually, he moved. Not out of shame, but because the world had changed locks on every door he used to enter. A coffee shop he frequented posted a new window decal: "No service without reflection." On the first day he returned, the cashier nodded, took his order, and when he asked for the Wi-Fi password, slid across a napkin that read, "Not for your version of the truth." He left the cup untouched. Later that week, a high school civics class played a video essay without narration, just music, just the frame. A student raised their hand and asked, "Why didn't she blink?" The teacher didn't answer. They just rewound and let the moment sit. The room, Langston, they said, had gone quiet by choice. She never corrected headlines, never sat for interviews. When offered a seat at a round table on reform, she declined, with a message delivered by courier. I've already said what I needed. You recorded it. It wasn't humility. It wasn't a retreat. It was in itself another kind of presence. When asked to reflect, she didn't. When asked to lead a panel titled Modern Heroism, she replied, I'm not the subject. The subject is what you did when you saw the footage. One university framed the freeze frame as part of an exhibit titled Authority and Witness. Underneath the glass, a plaque read, 11 centimeters of history. No audio, no quotes, just the space between. And still, the cadet wrote. Wrote not to immortalize, but to clarify. Not to tell a story, but to hold a question. They returned to frame 112, not as tribute, but as a mirror. Not to testify, but to reflect. And when all the theories exhausted themselves, when power, trauma, policy, and race had been run through every academic filter, they wrote one final sentence. I didn't study the weapon, I studied her eyelids. They never moved, not a flinch, not a wince, just vision, unbroken. The body of the piece unfolded with restraint. It didn't canonize Langston or demonize Holloway. It dissected the anatomy of response. The writer spoke of silence as resistance, stillness as testimony, and sight as a weapon more cutting than recoil. When everything was rigged against her, when the balance of power pointed in lead and policy, she didn't argue, plead, or posture. She held her ground. She held his eyes. The text pulsed with discomfort, not because it was angry, but because it forced the reader inward. We train for reflex, but no manual prepares you for the moment when your belief in power collides with the presence of someone who doesn't fear you. There was no embellishment, just lines that tightened like cords. And then the question posed not to history, but to the present. Who will you face when it's your turn? When procedure dissolves and all you have left is your stare. Will you hold it or will you blink? It wasn't just theory anymore. The article had slipped past footnotes and reached places doctrine never could. One morning, someone projected the text onto the glass wall of the Capitol Metro station. It stayed there until sunup washed it out, but long enough for commuters to pause, read, and shift uneasily. No signature followed the quote. It just lingered like something unfinished. On a subway seat that same day, a young woman took a photo of Holloway, unshaven and watching his reflection in the window, his badge now a memory, his name no longer prompting recognition. The post went viral not because of his posture, but because of the caption. Once trained us to look away, now can't find eyes to meet. The comments weren't cruel, but precise, surgical even. One read, power doesn't, it returns, unclaimed. Another, he still hasn't blinked, just can't look. Elsewhere, in a small town where no one had spoken his name in months, someone spray-painted over the local training facility's entry arch. The new words matched a line from the essay. Stillness is not the absence of fear. It's what remains after fear is named. By noon, it was removed, but the photo had already made the front page of 2 regional outlets. No one claimed responsibility, but the mural's absence spoke louder than its presence. In an unrelated forum thread that quickly turned related, a former officer posted a still image from frame 112. No text, no filter, just the moment the gun paused in space and time. It was reposted over 2 million times within 48 hours, often paired with comments like, "They taught us to measure threat. She measured intent," or more simply, "That frame is now required reading." At a leadership summit weeks later, a security firm executive opened their keynote with a slide of that same frame. The title above it read, "Accountability is not policy. It's memory." They didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The room was already silent, and when the lights dimmed, a technician in the back was caught whispering, "She didn't flinch." That line found its way onto stickers, shirts, screensavers, not as merchandise, but as protest, not to idolize, but to remind. In a separate incident, a protest banner was unfurled outside a courthouse where an unrelated excessive force trial was being deliberated. The banner read, 11 centimeters is enough to know who someone is. No chance followed, just stillness. Cameras caught it, viewers felt it. The article, stripped of ads, stripped of authorial flourish, found its way into training modules in 3 different jurisdictions. not mandated, chosen, not because it solved anything, but because it refused to look away. In one such session, a cadet was recorded saying, "If that stare were directed at me, I'd want to believe I deserve to hold it." Another responded, "You earn that kind of silence, but it doesn't get handed." In time, the piece was bound into a volume of essays about ethical presence in high-pressure situations. It wasn't the longest or most cited, but it was the only one read aloud by a graduating class of officers. Every cadet standing, every face turned toward the screen, as the final paragraph rolled silently across, but came back in unexpected ways. A theater company reinterpreted the frame as part of a performance art installation where actors stood unblinking before an audience while footage of routine stops played overhead. Patrons entered and exited without applause. There were no lines, no intermissions, just presence, just breathe. An art critic called it the loudest silence in recent memory. Meanwhile, a museum in D.C. submitted paperwork to purchase the original dashcam footage, not for sensationalism, but for its place in the evolving canon of American civic moments. They planned to name the exhibit not after Langston or Holloway, but after the question at the essay's end. Somewhere along the edges of all this, the cadet remained anonymous. M.R. Jenkins was not tracked down, not interviewed. Their identity wasn't the point. The message, stripped of ego, pressed forward. And still, in corners of training rooms and the pause before a command is given, instructors ask the same thing with their eyes before their mouths. Who will you be when no one is telling you how to be? What will you hold when the script ends? And in the places where this text was read aloud, not because it was a sign, but because it resonated, a pause always followed that final line. No one dared fill. When procedure dissolves and all you have left is your stare, will you hold it or will you blink? Near the end, the cadet allowed a note of vulnerability. I was told to learn tactics. I was taught to assert dominance. But after that clip, I wondered what strength looks like when it doesn't shout. What if it simply stands? There were no dramatic appeals, no capitalized slogans, just a single closing line typed beneath a signature with no rank. To General Langston, I don't know what you once were. I only know this. You did not look away. It wasn't a salute. It was something sharper. A reckoning. Thousands read it within the first week. Professors debated it. Recruits passed it around barracks like contraband conscience, but it didn't go viral. It went quiet, deep, like a root system beneath a building, not yet aware it's shifting. Meanwhile, in a small cafe across the river from where Holloway now lived in anonymity, someone printed the piece, folded it with clean precision, and slid it across a sticky table. He had been drinking coffee he didn't finish, and avoiding the mirror so he couldn't justify. He unfolded the paper, with fingers still carrying memories like splinters, read each word, paused on the phrase, "You did not look away," then folded the paper again, not to discard, but to contain. He didn't cry, he didn't curse, he sat, still, silent. Outside, the day moved like any other. Delivery trucks hissed against curbs, school buses released shrill laughter into crosswalks. Overhead, drones blinked in standard formation. No alerts, no broadcasts. But something had landed, not in the news feed, but in the bloodstream of a nation forced to remember that fear is not always loud and courage not always kinetic. In a classroom 4 states away, a civics teacher projected the article onto a whiteboard. Students read in silence. One raised their hand, not to ask a question, but to request that they pause at frame 112. "Can we stay here a minute longer?" they asked. No one objected, and they did, long enough to see that the absence of motion could shake the very foundation of how a society defines force. Langston, for her part, never commented on the article. She received a copy by post with no return address. She didn't frame it. She didn't file it. She tucked it beneath a stack of handwritten letters from people she had once commanded, but never controlled. Then she returned to her porch, the dog asleep by the step, and watched the same street passers-by drift through. There was no parade, no badge ceremony, only a moment mid-afternoon when a mother walking with her son paused in front of the gate, glanced up at Langston, and without a word, nodded. Langston returned it. Barely, but enough. History does not always chisel its names into stone. Sometimes it presses them into the breath of others. The woman who did not blink had become more than a symbol. She had become a question, and in asking it, had changed what strength would look like for the next generation. Not thunder, not armor, not even victory. Just refusal. To be afraid, to look away, to be anything but unshakably, unstoppably human.